This is Dr. Yousaf. Today we are going to talk about conceptualizing communication. So this is a very important topic, that how we conceptualize communication. When we conceptualize communication, there are two broader terms, the points of convergence as well as points of divergence. So in today's talk, we are going to talk about 3 points of convergence on which most of the communication scholars have agreement or they have consensus that this is called communication. So the first point of convergence is that communication is a process. So what does it mean? When we say that communication is a process, we mean that communication moves from a source to a receiver. In other words, it is a linear process wherein communication moves from the source to the receiver. David Barlow in 1960 popularized this idea over 60 years ago in these words, quote unquote, "If we accept the concept of process, we view events and a relationship as dynamic, ongoing, ever-changing, continuous. When we label something as a process, we also mean that it does not have a beginning, an end, a fixed sequence of events. It is not static at rest. It's moving. The ingredients in a process interact. Each affects all other processes." So this concept, which was popularized by David Barlow in 1960, over 60 years ago, is termed as communication as a process. Let me give another example of this process. You must have heard about SMCR model. This is what I was talking when we say that communication is a process. We mean source, message, channel, and receiver. If you look at the first letters of these words, source, the first letter S, message, the first letter M, channel, the first letter C, and receiver, the first letter R. So this becomes SMCR model. What does it mean? S means source, the communicator who creates a message or sends a message. And then M is a message. It can be stimuli, it can be symbolic, it can be verbal, whatever the communicator or the source sends, we call it a message. Then C stands for channel, medium through which message goes to the receiver. What message? The message which is created by the communicator, which we term as a source, and the message which the communicator creates, that's called stimuli, that passes through a channel or medium to go to the receiver. And this channel or medium, we term it as channel or medium. And then receiver, the destination of the message, the audience. So this SMCR model, in which the message from the communicator passes through the channel and goes to the audience. This is called communication as a process. Let me give you another example to explain this communication as a process phenomenon. You all know Lateral model of communication. What does this model means? Lateral model, or according to Lateral model, who says what, to whom, through what channel, with what effect. Now let me talk about this, because this is also considered a process approach of communication. In this Lateral model, who is the communicator, of course. Like SMCR model, there the source was communicator, here who is communicator, then says what? This is called message. In SMCR model, the message was a stimuli created by the communicator. Here, this message is created by who says what. Whatever the communicator is saying, we call it a message. And then, in SMCR model, that message goes through channel and receivers are called audience. In this model, Lateral's model, to whom, we call them audience. And then, through what medium, we call this channel. And of course, when a source or a communicator sends a message through a channel to the audience, all this process has an intention, and the intention is to change the behavior or attitude of the audience. We call it effect. So whenever there is a message, that message goes through a channel to the audience, those messages or a message have some sort of effect. We call this communication as a process. Why do we call this communication as a process? Because communication moves in a sequence of steps. This approach, in summary, is communication as a process. So the second point of convergence when we conceptualize communication is that communication is transactional. Transaction can be broken into two components. If we consider communication to be strictly action, what does it mean? Once again, we need to recall SMCR model. What does that mean? That a source presents a message to the receiver or an audience. Here, the reaction or the feedback of the receiver is not considered. What does it mean? It means the source creates a message, that message passes through a channel and goes to the audience. If we consider this, we label this approach as a hypodermic needle model or magic bullet model of communication. What does it mean? It means communication messages are like bullets which are directly shooted by the messenger or the communicator and which directly penetrate into the minds of the audience and have powerful, uniform, immediate effects on the audience. However, in contrast, if we view communication from an interaction perspective, because this is what we were calling an action. But if we think that communication is an interaction, what does it mean? It means we move beyond the magic bullet model to consider the importance of feedback from the receivers. So whenever we talk about feedback, we say that communication is not an action, rather now it becomes an interaction perspective. Here, both the message of the source and the feedback of the receiver are considered. An interaction perspective clearly goes beyond hypodermic needle model and acknowledges that communication is not strictly a one-way process with a direct, uniform, linear, and immediate powerful effects. Rather, it acknowledges that communication is interaction. What does it mean? It means when the messenger or the source sends a message through a channel to the audience, then audience also gives feedback. So this feedback makes this process as an interaction. However, there is one limitation in this process, and that is it is very simplistic as it treats source and the receiver in isolation. It considers limited influence between them. That's why even when we say that communication as an interactive perspective or communication is an interaction perspective, still it has limitation. However, to answer or address this gap, most contemporary communication scholars conceptualize communication in a transactional sense. A transactional view of communication, like an interaction view, includes important role of feedback. Moreover, unlike interaction perspective, transactional perspective goes further view in seeing communication as a process in which there is a constant mutual influence of communication participants. Because in interaction perspective, there was feedback, but that feedback was in isolation. However, in transactional view, both the participants, what does it mean? The sender of the message and the receiver of the message. In other words, the source and the receiver interact mutually. Let's consider an example. For example, a television show depicting violent acts might be viewed very differently by a child alone as compared with the children viewing in the company of their parents, discussing the program's contents as different things. So now this example has both interaction and transactional view. How we can differentiate? If a child is viewing a television program alone, because the child is interacting with the program, we call it interaction perspective. If the child is viewing the television program in the company of the parents are talking about the content of the programs with the child. So this becomes as a transactional view because continuously they are talking about the content, the quality of the content, the influence of the content, so that this mutual influence of the parents and the child makes this communication as a transactional view of communication. Let's now move to the third view of communication when we want to conceptualize communication. According to this view, communication is symbolic. To understand this perspective, you should know more general concept of sign. To explore sign, you need to have the knowledge of semiotics. What is semiotic? The science of signs is called semiotics. Now, the people who study semiotics see sign as something consisting of two parts, and those parts we cannot separate them from each other. These are called signifier and the signified. Let me give an example to explain the difference between signifier and signified. Consider the word book and the object made of paper and glue you hold in your hand right now. In this case, the signifier is the word book. The letters of the book like B, O, O, K. This is called signifier. And the signified is the physical object, like the book itself is signified and the letters of the book are signifier. This relationship is obviously not a perfect one-to-one correspondence. It is often called an arbitrary relationship because there is no mutual correspondence between signifier and signified. Early theorists in the field of semiotics such as Langer in her book in Philosophy in a New Key conceptualizes a sign as something that signals the presence of something else. So, according to Langer, a sign is something that signals the presence of something else. In this sense, smoke is a sign of fire and tears are a sign of sadness. But let me explain this why we call this relationship an arbitrary relationship. One important thing to note here is that even with these signs, there is not a match or perfect match between tears because tears can be shed in joyness as well. So, tears can be the sign of sadness and likewise, tears can be the sign of joyness. So, that's why we call that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary one. However, one thing which you must remember, a natural match exists between the signifier and the signified in this case. In contrast, Langer writes in her book Philosophy in a New Key, published in 1942, that symbols are not proxy of their objects, but they are vehicles for the concept of objects. This is now very important distinction between signs and symbols. Because symbols, what Langer wants to say that symbols are not proxy of their objects. Rather, they are used as a source or as a vehicle for the understanding of those objects. In other words, symbols hold an arbitrary rather than natural relationship to what they symbolize. Moreover, it is important to remember that a symbol has no inherent meaning. Symbols help us to understand the meaning of the objects for which they stand, but they don't have their own meaning inherent in them. What then is the relationship between the symbol and the referent? What does it mean? It means that what is the relationship between the symbol and the object for which the symbol signals? With most symbols, some degree of shared meaning exists between those who interact. This is true because symbols are developed through shared social experience. And these symbols exist with a symbol or with a system of other symbols. However, there is always imperfect relationship between a symbol and a referent. What does it mean? There is always a gap in understanding of the symbols and the objects for which they stand. We call those objects their reference. This gap would be smaller among those who share the same experience, for example, or those who are grown up in the same culture, those who belong to the same generation, or those who belong to the same profession. They have better understanding of the symbols and the objects for which the symbols signal. And the gap would be larger for those who are grown up in different cultures, and those who belong to the different generations, and those who also belong to different professions. Let me give one example here why the gap is smaller among those who belong to the same profession and why the gap is larger for those who belong to different professions. I take an example of a doctor. If you go to the doctor to get some treatment and doctor writes some medicine as a prescription, and you take that prescription and go to the pharmacist to buy a medicine. Now, because the doctor and the pharmacist almost belong to the same profession, the pharmacist understands the symbols of the language the doctor has wrote for prescribing you the medicine. But if you or me want to read that prescription, maybe it would be very hard for us to understand or for you to understand what the doctor actually has written. To conclude, when theorists say that communication is symbolic, they mean that it requires signs and symbols that have relationship to the reference. To conclude, when theorists say that communication is symbolic, they mean that it requires signs and symbols that have relationship to the reference. To some extent, that relationship is arbitrary. And I think you can understand what does we mean by arbitrary relationship by the examples which we have cited in this discussion. These symbols can be verbal. I mean, when we talk about symbols, the symbols can be verbal. For example, the use of language, we call it a verbal symbols. And non-verbal, for example, the use of facial expressions. Whenever we want to talk someone, but we don't want to use the language and we give facial expression, we call it non-verbal symbols. Another example of non-verbal communication is in an organizational context can explain this, that what we mean communication as a symbolic. Let me give you a very easy example. When you dress up in a suit for a job interview, that suit symbolizes many things. I mean, what does it mean? It means your respect for the company, your willingness to obey to the rules, your sense of organization, or your respect for the decorum. Note, this example indicates that a single suit symbolizes many different things in an organizational context. Other examples can be traffic signals. The traffic signals are the symbols which are used to communicate. Country flags, white flag, all stands for something. Though they don't have inherent meaning in them, but they signals some meanings, or in other words, they help us to conceptualize or understand the objects for they understand. I think this is all from today. I mean, how to conceptualize communication, points of convergence. In the next talk, we will have another topic to talk. Till then, take care.